Welcome to another Bioticast. I'm Tom Barbley, and today I have the pleasure again of talking with Imy Khan. Hello, Imy.
Hi, Tom. How are you doing?
Well, I was thinking about this leading into the podcast. Do you have a PhD?
I do, yeah. Yeah, I got my PhD in... so I got it over lockdown, actually. I have some horrible memories of writing my dissertation over the COVID pandemic. Yeah, so 2020, the late 2020, I got my PhD, yeah.
Right. So can I refer to you as Dr. Khan?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. You can do if you want. I don't know how many people call that. It seems to be a bit of a power play sometimes. The only time I refer to myself as Dr. Khan is when I book hotels for myself. I hope that I get a decent room.
Yes. Now, my father's an academic, and I talk to him on a weekly basis. In fact, ironically, because of artificial life, I wrote my honours degree associated with Today, Earwig, Tomorrow, Man, which was in Margaret A. Boden's philosophy of artificial life. But I was at a university that was quite... Sorry, you had a question?
No, sorry, I'm calm.
I was at a university that was quite against the notion... Well, basically anything associated with artificial life. The whole notion... I mean, Today, Earwig, Tomorrow, Man is about how cognition and the use of objects in vision analysis is useful to, I think, Rodney Brooks' robots at the time. And anyway, I wrote my dissertation on that, and the fellow who was supposed to be reviewing it disappeared. Well, he didn't disappear. He left the university without any notice. And yeah, my whole reach into academia kind of ended there, and I decided to follow the .com, what I call the speculative technology boom of the late 90s, and came over to the US having finished my honours. But it remained uncompleted for like 9 years because the university refused to acknowledge all the downsides of what had happened with it. So I'm not an academic in any way, but I have a close family member who is an academic. So I will call you Imy Khan going forward, and if you want to be called Dr. Khan, just let me know.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
So today is a kind of a bonus recording because we weren't planning on recording today, and I wanted to discuss music with you because it's something that's been very impactful in both of our lives. Do you want us to get started? What does music mean to you?
Yeah, so actually, yeah, thank you. So it's something that you mentioned in the previous episode that I forgot to circle back to. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation. I mean, music. It's at a certain point, not too long ago, actually, I would have probably referred to myself as a musician in some sense, and we can speak a little bit about what that means and sort of this quote unquote quasi career that might have happened. I think for me, music has been huge. It's been a creative outlet, which I think as scientists, as academics, as human beings, everybody needs. And I think I have come from a family of, well, I say a family. My dad was or is in the music business. So when I was younger, he owned a couple of record labels and dealt with like talent and artist management and so on to various scales. Some sort of like local talent, but some international talent as well, and would work with people like the BBC here in the UK and so on. He had a studio, so he had a set of producers and musicians and stuff that worked with him. And he had a studio up until actually I think I was 18, and various things happened, and he was getting rid of it. And he kept asking me for about 7 or 8 years. He was asking me if I wanted to get involved in this music business, and I was like, I don't want to get involved. And sod's law is he gets rid of it, and a year later I decide that I'm interested in music production. So like taking my own path there, yeah. But sort of that's sort of the genesis of my interest / quote unquote career in music. That sort of began when I was 18, 19 years old, I guess, which is about 13. God, no, it wasn't 13 years ago. It was 14 years ago.
Believe me.
But yeah, I mean, that was me.
That's fascinating. You? That's absolutely fascinating. I have a couple of questions. In terms of the international artists, I mean, I'm assuming, did your father operate out of London?
Out of where, sorry?
Were you based in Birmingham originally? Did your father operate out of Birmingham?
In Blackburn, actually. So this was in Lancashire. So
wonderful. I know Blackburn, Lancashire. very good.
Oh, very well. How do you know Platinum?
Well, I used to live in the UK. I lived in Wilmslow. Well, I lived in Leicester initially and then Wilmslow. Yes, I'm very familiar with the Northwest.
Wow, yeah. I mean, I've got very good things to say about the Northwest anyway. So he was based, and the labels and so on were based out of the Northwest, so in Blackburn. But he did, in terms of international, so he worked a lot with, I mean, they're probably not household names to anybody that might be listening here, but certainly in certain pockets of the globe, so, places like Asia and stuff, these were, fairly prominent artists that he was working with. But, when you're a kid, you don't really, because they're not, these are not the artists that I know and I'm watching on TV. They're not really people that I care that my dad is working with necessarily. So it sort of just, it passed me completely.
Interesting. So how young were you when you started playing music?
Wow. So I should say I'm not a formally trained musician. I'm sort of, as many people are, I guess, sort of self-taught and just you pick up various things. But I remember for my 10th birthday, actually, I got a MIDI keyboard that you plug into the PC, and yeah, I mean, every time I plugged it in, it you would just hear the PC just heat up. The fan would go and it would just heat up because that was the state of the PCs at the time. But yeah, no, it was nice. It sort of just taught you, how to play a keyboard, just a small keyboard. And I was kind of interested. I mean, I've really enjoyed music, listening to music and watching musicians. Even now, I'll go to, live gigs as much as I can and as much as my aging knees and ankles will allow me to.
Yes.
But yeah, so 10 I think would be my first real exposure to, having a play with creating music, let's say.
Well, my story, as is the case with a lot of aspects of this podcast, is long and tortured. I started playing music. The family had an upright piano, so I started playing music on the upright piano, but I did violin and trombone for a period of time. I had quite a formal music education with the view that when it came to actually going to university, certainly seeking potentially doing a music degree rather than the physics and philosophy degrees I ended up doing, was certainly on the cards. It's always interesting because you get to that stage when you're about 18. I've had a number of friends who actually made the decision to do music formally rather than physics or whatever they were doing at school up until that point. And I was slightly jealous about that. I had this strange situation where when I left university, I went on effectively an international tour studying VR labs. And what I was going to do when I got back to Australia was spend about 6 months recording an album, which is what I really wanted to do. I mean, I love playing the piano and I worked with musicians and recorded them. Ironically, with my artificial life simulation, the computer that I got from the Australian Film Commission, I got a grant from the Australian Film Commission, who was at the time funding digital technology folks as well. So it enabled me to record CD quality audio, and then there was a bunch of post-processing and a bunch of additional things that I did. So music for me is really something where I made a distinct choice at somewhere in my life that I wasn't going to be a formal musician. I wasn't going to continue to pursue it, but I do go back periodically. And it's interesting, actually, my current relationship with music, because when the comedian, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the history of what was previously called Noble Ape, but when the comedian started doing his IP assault, I thought this would be a really good time to actually take a majority of my music and move it into digital audio so people could actively download it. So if folks are listening in, type my name, Tom Barbalet, into your favorite music streaming service of choice, and you should get some stuff coming up. So music for me was just so, I had a very long-standing relationship with a piano teacher who also taught me musicianship. I sang in choirs. It was basically my life while I was in Australia. And what came out of this in terms of kind of modern times is, firstly, I put a bunch of my music that I recorded in the late 90s, which would be loosely referred to as, I guess, electronic experimental hip-hop, potentially, because I did record scratching and a variety of other things with it as well. But the thing that reaches back into artificial life was I was always interested in the underlying frequencies within audio, and I started calling them the genetics of audio, and then started manipulating them with kind of genetic experiments as you would do with artificial life simulation. And it produced audio which I referred to at the time as polymorphic sound. I wasn't as keyed in with regards to using A-Life associated with everything I worked on that had something to do with genetics or some interest. So if folks are interested in listening in Genetics, which is actually the name of the track, which exemplifies parts of the aspects of polymorphic sound, was a recording that I did in the late 90s, and it's actually been played on classical radio in Australia. It's probably the most radio exposure I've ever gotten for my music. I have gotten bits and pieces of radio exposure for lesser tracks, but Genetics was a favourite whenever they wanted to say, oh yes, and there are these Australian experimental musicians, while I was living in the US at the time. But so Genetics is probably the best description of this. So I had a very old piano, which was made by Richard Lip and Son, which my friends used to call Rich Lips because that's what was printed out on the piano. And that I would play for hours and hours on end. I was very interested in just this almost emotional catharsis. I mean, that's the thing that music strikes me with. That the music, in particular digital music that I've recorded in the past, 4 years and put out, is completely about catharsis. It's about saying, I have these innate abilities to play this instrument, and I want to just create an experiment out of it and play it out. So, ironically, the polymorphic sound, which I haven't actually touched, I was thinking about this coming to this recording. I worked with a fellow called Tom Erb, who's very well known in the experimental music circles. In fact, I've met a number of people in my kind of day-to-day life who are experimental musicians who know about Tom Erb's work. He was at CalArts at the time, so I used my genetic analysis with a package that he'd written called SoundHack. I was a kind of expert user of SoundHack for many years. But that, I don't know, in a kind of precursory view, is the current stuff I have online, everything that's tagged 2020, is more of the kind of jazz experimental ragtime. It kind of goes through a variety of different phases. But when I put it online initially, people were quite confused because I've been known for kind of computer experimental music up until that time. I said, no, that's actually my fingers hitting the keyboard. It's actually, there's a human behind it playing it. But anyway, that's my intro into music, if I could give a kind of potted history.
Yeah, wow. I mean, yeah, that's fascinating. So you mentioned that you used to do some scratching. Mm-hmm. So this was was this DJing?
So yes. My early history in Australia as well is with regards to DJing, both in nightclubs and for one musical group. We're going to get to theism, but this was a very strange Pentecostal musical group. As I used to tease people at the time, I said I would DJ for Satan himself if I had to. It didn't mean that the DJing for a religious group, just meant that I was constantly touring with them. And they would fill these halls when they cheered. It's the only time in my life that I've been remotely attracted to the opposite sex. Like the power of being a DJ in a group, and just the power of a bunch of, because I like to dance as well. Like, I mean, this music lends itself very heavily to dancing, as you mentioned, with regards to your wonky knees. So, once I was done, I'd do a DJ set with the band. Typically, I'd do a bit on my own, and then I'd go into the crowd and start dancing. And I'd end up being surrounded by these, I don't know how old they were at the time, probably 17, 18-year-olds, maybe 16, who even knows. But I'd go out into the crowd with these people and immediately start dancing, and I'd get quite a throng of people dancing around me. So performing for a musical group, even though they were, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Pentecostal religious movement at all. We can talk a little bit more about that when we get to theism. But they were a very strange group. They were Potter's House Pentecostals, which mean that they had they're almost like Mormons. They had an even greater script that they were reading from, but we'll get to theism another time. But yes, DJing was a large part of my life. I still have one turntable. I don't have two turntables anymore. But I think this is something for my daughters to explore at some stage. I love teaching my younger brothers and their younger friends how to scratch and how to do basic DJing, because I think that it's a skill where once you understand that you've got this record moving and you're moving your hands and you've got to control the music in a certain way, and, back spins and scratching, it all came to me. The reason it came to me, I should point this out, was in 1991, my father was at UCLA. And I'd been to England once, but I think, just England once. But I went to UCLA. Well, I went to LA, and because of the way my father works, I had to go to summer school while I was there, which is a very strange thing if you know anything about American summer schools. And at the summer school, I was the only Caucasian. Actually, that's not true. There was one guy who walked to the school with me who was the other Caucasian, but it was predominantly African American, some Latino, but predominantly African American. And they just took me in. They just completely befriended me. I was in Australia, I don't know, I sound like I sound now when I lived in Australia. So they always thought to me, why, where are you from? What's the deal with your accent, even though I was born in Australia? So it was the first time that I felt really welcomed. And my father lived opposite Rhino Records. Rhino Records is quite a well-known label. It's had a bunch of different artists that have appeared on it, including hip-hop acts. So I would go down into Rhino Records and kind of dig in the crates at Rhino Records, age, 13. So I came back to Australia with records. And that was the origin of my DJing. And then, of course, thousands of broken turntables. But having to buy my own turntables, which broke on a regular basis, was like the kind of continuation of that. But, DJing in nightclubs and things like that is pretty cool as well. I preferred the live music that I did just because it was more participatory in some regard. But you can still get an amazing crowd participation when you DJ in nightclubs. So anyway, I haven't done that for about 20 plus years. I remember when we first moved to Vegas, DJ Adam was starting a residency here, and I thought, I wonder if I started DJing again, if I could get a residency in Vegas. But anyway, that's my background with DJing.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, we so in our sort of hip hop collective, I never know what to call it. It's not really a band. Mm-hmm. There are 4 of us, 5, depending on whoever sort of features. There is a DJ, and he has been DJing, so he's maybe 10 years older than me, and he's probably been DJing since he was, since a young child. And on any given day, I will just go to his house, and he'll have his turntables out, and he'll be scratching, he'll be going through his vinyls, and just putting things together. And I think it is really nice. I find it fascinating. So, I've got my own sort of record collection. Vinyls, a few hundred, and they're mostly for sampling purposes, and we could talk a little bit more about sampling as well if you want. I've sort of collected them at, I guess what you would call them yard sales or markets, or just in bulk. Not really hoping for anything in particular, but the hope that you pick up 30 or 40 records and you go through them and you find a nice sample, you find a nice little loop that you can pull and change the pitch or the speed of and do whatever you might.
Yeah, a variety of things.
But then I go to his house and, he has thousands of records. And just on any given evening, he's just, he does a lot of gigs. So, he's still doing stuff at clubs and at various events. So he'll get pulled into weddings or birthdays. And I guess the stuff that DJs don't particularly like to do, but maybe the stuff that pays the bills sometimes. He just explores. Most of his time as a DJ is just spent in his studio, his garage, just scratching and just practicing his craft. And I think that's fascinating. Even at his age and with his experience, he would say 30 plus years of DJing, he's still just enjoying being a DJ. And I think that's really cool.
Mm. Yeah, my relationship with music is rather curious because I come back to it. Like, it's something that I return to periodically, and particularly through COVID, I used it as an opportunity to do a lot of experimental composition and actually recording some of that and putting it out. But it's something where I would love to have a dedicated... I have a Imy USB keyboard that I do a lot of my composition on, so I do have the accoutrement, so to speak. Records are really difficult if you want to travel internationally or move your location. That's something. So I've really thinned my records out in the past probably 2-3 years. I now have a single flight case which is mainly containing a lot of the records that I used to sample from. And let's talk about sampling as a phenomena, because that was something that I took away from my time in LA. And certainly early on I realized if I was going to make certainly things that people were going to rap over or just sing over or do whatever they were going to do over it, I had to have a relatively large sample collection. And as you say, the benefit of when I lived on campus, I would go to the university records sales, and they were, $2 records basically. So you could really dig deeply and find a bunch of, eclectic stuff with just $20 quite comfortably. And you'd walk away with 10 records and hopefully maybe 1 or 2 really good samples out of the 10 records.
Yeah, no, that's exactly. I couldn't tell you the amount of times that I have, I've gone into a thrift store or a charity shop and, I've spent no less than £5 and come out with 5 or 6 records, and I'll play one of them. And it'll be a record from like the 60s or the 70s of some obscure artist that I've never heard of. And I'll listen to a track and I'll be like, how have I never heard this song before? It is incredible. Because I'm listening. What I'm trying to do is I'm not listening for the song, but I'm listening for parts that I can take out from it and sample. But I do think, I mean, yeah, you have sort of a hip hop background, so I guess we can talk about, you know, some of the stick that sampling gets I think sometimes, and you know, people do see it as, you know, cheating or copying or
theft fundamentally. That you're fundamentally stealing. Yeah.
Yeah, but the idea that you can listen to something that already exists, modify it and manipulate it in a way that you like, you know, in a way that gives you something new, I think is fundamentally what science does anyway. Nothing in science very few things in science exist without being built on something that has already existed. You know, we already take existing ideas and concepts, we extend them, we apply them, and then we go ahead and publish papers about how we've extended or applied them. And sampling is the same thing, I think. I do think it's... I think if you go in to listen to records, or in my case, many times what I tend to do is play, you know, strange video games, or we'll watch foreign TV shows or movies and listen to the soundtrack. And what it does is when you commit to that idea of using a sample, I think your experience with all sorts of media changes, because you're not just watching a movie, you're just not playing a game, but you're actually listening to the things underneath, and your mind's constantly working as to, oh, you know, what can I use here? Can I use this? You know, that snare sounded really nice. That, you know, that drum roll's amazing. And yeah, for me, it was a way to engage with media in ways that I don't think I would have done otherwise.
Yes, yeah. It is fascinating. I'm not sure if any of your music is available through streaming services or online, but it's interesting to see the various streaming services are very coy now about actually allowing sampled music on their streaming services, because the group De La Soul comes to mind, because De La Soul has recently, finally, after nearly 20 years, gotten their music on electronic streaming. It's very curious to me, because I listen to a variety of different groups. Of all of them, De La Soul, although 3 Feet High and Rising, their first the first album they put out, has probably, I think the number is close to 120 uncleared samples, and they were finally sued by the Turtles of all groups. But listening to their stuff, I realized that the whole nature of sampling as it goes in streaming is a brand new and, in many regards, uncharted world. I think about that because, obviously, with my stuff in the late 90s, aside from the originally recorded music, the polymorphic sound stuff, it was all samples. It was all drum break samples. It was all, you know, even some of my more eclectic tracks were quite famous pieces of music played backwards. One of my favorite things to do was to take well-known records. I'm talking about things like the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's. I mean, you know, really very mainstream records that are very well-known, and play them, just little samples of them backwards, because people would still get the same kind of emotional energy from the songs without knowing, oh, this is Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. No, it's the whatever the electronic harpsichord part of that played backwards, where you get almost the exact same emotive force associated with the audio, but it's not actually the same audio. So now it's really fascinating to see how these electronic streaming services are now kind of cutting and dividing. For example, YouTube Online has a completely different set of requirements to Apple Music, which has a completely different set of requirements to Spotify. And these labels now have to be really careful of what they're putting out. I've had an experience recently where a bunch of my reissued stuff was, I think, tagged in Spotify, so you can't stream it on Spotify, but you can still stream it on Apple Music and YouTube. And through this experience recently, my streaming service that I use to stream all my music has given me a free code to actually publish a new album. Which is an amazing incentive to actually start working on music once again. But the sample is a very curious thing in terms of its history. It predates hip-hop music, but it's so heavily exploited in hip-hop music. And what's interesting is finding examples of the sample outside of hip-hop music. There's a lot of rock and eclectic music, a lot of modern music now actively samples from old music, which is very curious.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So yeah, the origins of hip hop, we not all know. I guess some of the listeners are probably a bit naive to it, but it did start in things like disco and rhythm and blues and things like that. But yeah, like you said, in more modern days, it has, people are finding samples from all over the place. People are, even sampling spoken word out of movies, for instance, and finding creative ways to sample those. But yeah, I mean, on that front, we have, I should say, various EPs on various streaming services. I don't think, I mean, I should say, yeah, most of them have samples on them, or use them quite frequently. I don't think they've been pulled so far. I should probably double check that because I've not looked at them for a couple of years. But as far as I'm aware, Spotify it's passed the Spotify test. So maybe I've done a really good job of just disguising the sample. Who knows? But yeah, you are right. I think. Well, I don't know. I think there is a case to be made that samples, should they be cleared? Probably. I think if it's a case of if you're actively going to make money off something that you are sampled, then I mean it's much like the case with like the image generators for the AI stuff, right? And using all of the training data that comes from existing artists' work. It's like somebody has to get compensated. You can't just take that for free. So in some senses, I agree that if you're exploiting somebody's work and you're making a pretty buck of it, then there is some cases to be made that you should clear those samples at least, or pay the necessary parties their dues. But if you are, again, just a hobbyist, I guess if you're going to use that term and you're just taking small samples, or drum breaks, for instance, or cutting a kick drum or a snare and finding creative ways to create new drum sequences, I don't know. I think people should be fine with that. But yeah, I don't know the rules with respects to all the different platforms. I should probably check. It's probably my best interest to check that. But I've not had any issues so far. But I do, yeah. I don't know. In a way, sampling feels like evolutionary in a sense, right? Like almost that we have loops and clips of all these instruments. And effectively what we're doing as musicians or hip hop musicians or producers is just manually adding this element of mutation or variation in a sense, and then combining it with something else and creating this new thing. Yeah, I mean, if there is like a far-reaching tie into A life somewhere with the music, it can be that. But no, yeah, I think it's cool. I think I have many thoughts about sampling, but I do think it needs to get the respect. It just needs to get more respect than it does. I think the general consensus, the perspective is that it is just cheating, but I think people do need to, have a different appreciation of it. Because at least for me, when I listen to music and I listen to quite a bit of hip hop, and if there's like a sample that I recognize, I mean, an example is, so maybe you might be familiar with this artist known as Wiz Khalifa, who's like this more recent hip hop artist. And there was a song, I can't remember the song's name, but it might have been on a mixtape actually. And the instrumental, there was a loop, and I instantly recognized the loop, and it was from like this Japanese RPG game. And not only did I enjoy then the song, but you get this new appreciation for that music because you have this connection with this song, with this artist. But like, I know that song, I enjoy that game, and I really love what you've done with that sample. And I think sometimes, having these samples that you can recognize, I think is really nice, and it just changes the way that you can listen to these songs that are coming out from these musicians. But similarly, it also gives us an opportunity it gives artists an opportunity to expose new audiences to an existing melody or an existing sound that, might have existed 30, 40 years ago in their lifetime, that a new generation might not have been familiar with. I've heard, I couldn't tell you the song names, but there are songs probably in the charts at the moment that are sampling songs from my childhood. And in a sense, I'm like, why are they recreating these songs? These songs have just been released, but they haven't just been released. They came out 30 years ago. And what the songs are doing is taking these songs and, repurposing them for a new audience. And I think that's really cool as well. Because what you do then is give a nod to those artists and say, you respect that this is a really good song, so much so that you are going to reintroduce it to a brand new audience or a brand new generation that might have not come across it otherwise.
Certainly. And there's no one poorer than a new musician. I mean, this is the difficulty with regards to sampling. And certainly, the De La Soul example is a good one. When they were creating 3 Feet High and Rising, they weren't multimillionaires. They were just sampling what they could. And the notion of how this, I mean, obviously there's a kind of fiduciary element to it, but how this thing is fundamentally paid back is something which I don't think is properly addressed. I mean, when I used to work with musicians and, did this kind of stuff, I realized that we were all as poor as each other. Like there were no standouts. Yeah. None of us were famous in any capacity. None of us had made a decent income ever. So the nature of sampling, the kind of lowest on the pay scale are the ones who probably should kick up financially, just strikes me as kind of antithetical to my experiences. And I also think that the nature of musicians that litigate associated with sampling is really tired. And there's you might not be familiar with this, but there's a band called Men at Work, and they have a song called I Come From Land Down Under, which samples quite a prominent, the flute loop in that is quite a prominent Australian song, like an Australian folk song. Well, actually, it turns out it's not an Australian folk song. There's still a copyright holder, and they sued Men at Work. I think the flautist actually died through the period of the litigation. I mean, it was particularly horrible, but it made you realize that even these songs from our childhood, as you say, contained kind of derivative music, and the whole notion that the final litigator was the holding company associated with the song that everyone assumed was a folk song, but turned out not to be a folk song. It was always kind of curious, but I did want to throw this back to the other topic that I've written down quasi-career. Because when you said that, I'm like, my life is full of quasi-careers. Like this is if I've done anything professionally, it's been very successfully being able to, well, actually a majority of the quasi-careers aren't actually paying careers, but it is a fascinating idea. I did want to touch briefly. We have a bit more time. We could talk about the Jeffrey talk, but you also said that you wanted to talk about role-playing games for all the poor, long-suffering Biotacast listeners that are hoping we'll get to some artificial life-related discussion in this. But I think that is a fascinating... Oh, from the Jeffrey talk, is there anything that you wanted to talk about specifically?
No, I think I was going to ask the question to you and say if there was anything that maybe wasn't covered in that talk that you might want to expand on. I mean, there was the idea because you mentioned I can't remember the exact details, but effectively that you had a telephone. What's the word? A big data set. Right? Yeah, yes. A telephone directory where you had this massive data set, and it was like a data matching problem in trying to identify all the different businesses and stuff that were in the internals of buildings in London at this given time. And I thought, I mean, I was walking through the park when I was listening to that particular episode, and yeah, I didn't have any clear ideas as to how I might address that, but it's one of those questions. It's like, oh, that's a really interesting data problem to have. And I just wondered if, I can't remember the conclusion of that conversation, but whether you had got any closer to trying to solve it.
Well, it's associated with perfectly venting from the discussion associated with sampling. It was associated with copyright. I don't have access to that data. I was for a period of time, although I no longer am, a member of Ancestry, like the paid version of Ancestry, which gave me access to individual pages of the phone directory. We're talking about 2,400 pages worth of text, I think, of that order, which would have to be scanned in, would have to be OCR'd. The really critical information that came from that was associated with, I think they're called postcodes in the UK. It's one of these terms where they're called zip codes in the US. I think they're called postcodes in the UK. Yeah. You would then get the postcodes, which ironically haven't actually changed since the Second World War. So you can then get the postcodes, and then you'd know street address and postcode, what the actual location, and you could map this back onto the data set of London. Now, similarly to having to scan in these phone directory pages, well, actually, that's not true. They all exist digitally. That's what's so frustrating about this. That basically, I got in contact with the British Telecom Archives, which are one of the two holders that Ancestry.com holds, the other holder, and just said to them, like, this is what my project's about. It's about London in 1940. I'm not going to make any money out of this thing, per our prior discussion. And this would be a great data set to have. Of course, the fear is, as I did with the maps were something that the Library of Scotland actually sold. So as soon as I paid for the maps, I immediately tidied them up and put up a Creative Commons license on them and made sure that free as in free was actually going to be adhered to with the maps. This was a brilliant data set, but it was just one that I ended up downloading maybe 25 pages to get a sense of, if I had the data set, what would it mean? Now, there's a thing with the British Telecom Archive is absolutely fascinating. Unfortunately, I've dealt with far too many of these kind of eclectic groups with their own particular interests dealing with the London 1940 stuff. But once we had the maps and Bob Mottram's algorithm, although it's not perfect, we had a good way of translating what were PNG files into JSON files. And JSON files are infinitely more interrogatable than PNG is if you're looking at this kind of data set. So my hope would have been to get access to, 2,400 pages worth of 1940 London phone directory, and then OCR that sufficiently, hopefully, that the postcodes would remain intact and the street address would remain intact. And then it's still a huge cross-referencing problem then, because thankfully the postcodes are relatively well maintained in the actual locations. I think you can get them down to street cuttings in London, like, this side of the street is on this postcode, this side of the street is on that postcode. But the nature of this London 1940 problem, let's call it a problem, was there was just so much data available, and it was a way of trying to map the data into whatever underlying format you were using here, primarily JSON, which was then saved out. The Ape SDK has a lot of additional kind of JSON eclectic handlers, particularly with regards to moving them into fast accessible memory arrays, which is really a very difficult programming problem in and of itself, which I had to solve early on. But the nature of London 1940 was it was just almost an onion of these problems. You get through one layer and then you get to the next layer. You get through another layer and then you discover 5 layers back you were going through the wrong layer. And you had to revisit what you were doing 5 layers ago. Like, it really was quite... And this is before my daughters were born, or even for the first year that they were born, I worked heavily on London 1940. Now it's just a data set. I was contacted through the week, actually, by someone who was asking about the maps and where to get access to the maps. The maps are available on GitLab as well, under the Creative Commons license. So, my hope is somewhere, maybe by putting this audio out into the ether, that someone will say, I'm really interested in that project. But the thing that struck me most about doing this thing is people in England really aren't interested in 1940 because they have the Blitz, they have a bunch of additional kind of attacks on London. And because I was looking to actively simulate that in some regard, it turned a bunch of people off that as well. I think C-Line is absolutely fascinating in terms of just the way, if you look at the simulations of C-Line, they were all about, 60,000 to 80,000 Germans landing on British soil. England at the time could have easily deterred that, even with the Home Guard. So my view is that if C-Line had occurred and the Germans were doing it, it would occur prior to Barbarossa when they invaded the Soviet Union. It would have been probably a similar number of soldiers. So we're talking literally in the millions of soldiers as opposed to the tens to hundreds of thousands of soldiers. So my interest was just to simulate the resiliency of London with a simulated group of Home Guard entities. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Home Guard at all. There's this show in England called Dad's Army, which was a kind of joke about the Home Guard. But the Home Guard was literally your father, and his buddies from the First World War getting together with their rifles and reminiscing about old times with the hope that if Germans ever landed in England, but London specifically, that the Home Guard would be able to defend. So there are all these layers to the London 1940 stuff back when it was SimC-Line. But then when it moved into London 1940, the telephone directory, unfortunately, is just a block along the path of now I have to start randomly populating a variety of professions and testing the economy of the city simulation that I have because I can't actually get the original data.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I mean, just on that last point, actually, Dad's Army is, I am familiar with it. I've never actually watched it. It's one of those shows that tends to be on one of those cable television channels that you scroll through every now and then. Yeah, maybe it came out before I was born, actually.
Probably did.
Just to age me a little bit, yeah. Well, I don't know.
The eclectic thing about sorry to interrupt you, but the eclectic thing about Dad's Army is it accurately portrays, and these are a decreasing number of groups, but throughout England there were Home Guard. So throughout England, almost every town in England has had at some time a historical association with regards to capturing the local heroes who predominantly were. Well, it's the whole thing about the Home Guard is really very curious. So sorry for interrupting you.
No, I think it's good. I think in a separate conversation that I've had recently, actually, it's a little bit with my wife as well. So I don't know what your thoughts are, and I don't know too much about it, but there is this somewhat glorification of the World War II period, at least in the UK. And I mean, I don't know enough about the history to understand why. But yeah, I mean, just through saying, the existence of the Home Guard is probably case in point, right? Is that there is something about that period that we just, as a society, especially in the UK, we just love talking about. And I don't know why it is. But then, I think what you said before sort of is counter to that point where people don't really like talking about it. So
it's a strange kind of juxtaposition that I think certainly the revival of reenactment groups and these kind of things. I mean, there are many different layers to this. Through COVID, there were a series of books. My wife's book group read a bunch of them that came out based in London in the 1930s and 40s. There is this is fundamentally conservatism as well, although that digresses very rapidly. But there is an idea that there was a better time, or we have access to a better time in the past. But when you actually talk, I mean, when I was in England, they stopped doing the Battle for the Atlantic. They stopped remembering it. Literally, actually, my neighbour at the time was a mariner on one of these, vessels that crossed the Atlantic. But England, for whatever reason, decided at the time that they weren't going to continue to hold a memorial every year for this very important part of the Second World War. But it is very curious that I think there are two sides to this thing. On one side, people like to remember it in a very almost antiquated, almost fake positive light, when actually, people were killed through that period of time. Families lost a variety of loved ones, spouses, brothers, the actual impact that the war had on the UK. But in contrast, I've worked with a number of colleagues who were on the European mainland, or whose family were on the European mainland. It's amazing, actually, the distinction between those on the European mainland that don't want to remember these things fundamentally versus, as you say, this strange positivity associated with remembering it in England. But when you dig into it, when I'm talking about simulating football hooliganism because it represents what the Home Guard, the kind of local fighting styles might have been like, it's taking it a bit too far. It's very interesting that it's a strange relationship where you want to remember it in one part, but you don't want to remember a bunch of stuff associated with it. Anyway.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I would love to have a separate conversation with you about that, especially with the football hooliganism. I know we've spoken in our first conversation, actually, this idea of football hooliganism, and I know you spoke with Jeffrey about it as well. But I mean, I've been to, I'm probably going a little bit off topic now, but yeah, I mean, I have been to a lot of football matches over my life, and I've seen some hooliganism.
Have you been taken off trains? Because, I mean, my experience with regards to this, we live very close to Manchester United. We'd occasionally be on trains, and we'd be pulled off trains and then filmed. They have video cameras. Have you ever had that happen to you with the police?
No. No, I don't think so. Actually, which is probably quite fortunate for me. But I do think so. I'm a Manchester United fan, actually. So I think at least in those areas, the Manchester United fans don't tend to be. I mean, there's hooliganism everywhere, but there you probably know this. There is like some level of like organized hooliganism, especially in like European football. They have these ideas of like ultras, so ultra fans who, yeah, gosh, I went to Gothenburg football in April, so their first game of the season, and I think ultras are a different level of football fanatic. For 90 minutes they are shooting fireworks in the air and banging big massive drums, and will actively go out, and these are the type of groups that will actually go out and look for organized fights with other groups of fans. Yeah, I mean, and there are pockets of that. So you probably know places like Millwall and West Ham and places like that. Yeah. So I do think it's probably dependent on where in the country you are. Places in Scotland, Glasgow Rangers and Celtic have probably got quite passionate fans as well. Yeah. No, I don't know where I was going with that, but there we are.
It's a thing, football hooliganism. I think that was the takeaway from that. Yes.
Yeah.
So, digressing very rapidly, if we haven't digressed enough, if we haven't done any non-artificial life-related topics, I had written down, because this is something that obviously we touched on in the last recording, role-playing games. And you also said choose-your-own-adventure role-playing games in or choose-your-own-adventure books. What's your background history with this stuff?
Not a lot. So again, I have some. It's really interesting. So you had mentioned this idea of like world building and mythology in our last conversation with respect to your simulations, and it got me thinking a little bit about some of the experiences that I've had with like role playing games and these text based role playing games. In particular, actually, my experience, although it came a little bit late, was through forums. Actually, so I played, for anywhere between 10, so maybe 6 or 7 years, actually, would play this role-playing game as a text-based, in a text-based format on, various, PHP, BB forums, where you assume the role of a character, or, you might be a game master or a dungeon master or whatever that might be. And you're literally just, you're typing and you're creating a post in the style of your character, explaining what your character is going to do and so on and so forth. And then you're just sitting at your screen and just hitting the refresh button and waiting for somebody else to post who might be in the same game with you. So yeah, but I mean, we can come back to that. I think your experiences are probably more than mine. So I guess the reason I raised this point and raised this question is because I was just really interested in just exploring that a little bit more from your experiences, and just a little bit more about how that might have influenced this idea of world building and story building and narrative in some of your simulations.
Well, I have an existing podcast called My Rules Are Better, which is basically around this. It's really fascinating that, these things are pretty well shared of people. I'm assuming we're probably separated by at least a decade, but of people of a similar kind of... It's really associated with your kind of background interests, your particular proclivities associated with exploring, virtual worlds and this kind of stuff. I met two gentlemen, one called Steve Jackson, one called he wasn't a Sir when I met him, but Sir Ian Livingston. And they created a company called Games Workshop, which is obviously huge. It's a multi-billion-dollar company now. And they were part of my early introduction to this thing through Fighting Fantasy game books. But for me, it was... So I actually I'm currently in the process of publishing a role-playing game book, just back to this discussion of quasi-careers over one's life. But so role-playing for me is something that's very intimate, very much associated with a particular period in my life. And really, it's almost thespian. You're basically play acting to a small group of people that you're playing the game with. And recently, with work, actually, I had to have a colleague who actually appears in the My Rules Are Better podcast, Derek, who came to Netflix where I work, and he had never done any role-playing in his past. And this was just like, what? You can't call yourself a nerd of some ilk and not have done any role-playing. So after, I don't know, probably 20 years, maybe, it was with the latest edition of Dungeons & Dragons, which was 5th edition, to show how old I was. 1st edition was what I played predominantly when I was role-playing. Anyway, so we played a game which went on for about 18 months, every week, but sometimes every other week through the more difficult periods where we couldn't get the numbers. But we had about 12 people that would show up we basically would finish work and then do the role-playing at the office. And I tested my role-playing game, Just Plain Chaos, which is the one that I'm working on currently getting published, which actually has a really interesting set of vends into a variety of different topic discussions, because when I was young, you may have heard of this gentleman, Julian Assange, who's probably one of the most famous Australians that has existed in the past 100 years. Well, I knew Julian Assange back in Australia. I wrote antiviral software for the Australian government, amongst other things. And I knew Julian Assange because there was this community. Within the antiviral community, you need to study where these viruses are coming from. You need to create a very interesting history. This ultimately is artificial life, pre-artificial life for my work. But anyway, so that is Just Plain Chaos. Just Plain Chaos is actually a somewhat abstract set of removals from knowing people like Julian Assange and what I did with regards to my antiviral software. Anyway, returning to role-playing. Role-playing for me is just something that I'm surrounded by books, and probably about, I don't know, maybe a third of them, maybe a quarter of them are role-playing game specific. So it's not just, it's a very specific period, and Jackson and Livingston were just so seminal and fascinating. I'm not sure if you've met any of your childhood heroes periodically. I've spent a lifetime meeting my childhood heroes. Have you ever gone out and met your childhood heroes? It's just a...
I'm thinking about it. I don't think I have. I mean, there is that age-old saying of never meet your heroes. I don't know. I don't know how accurate that is. But, I mean, nothing comes to mind. No.
So when I was 18, I met a fellow called John Draper Crunch, and I've actually written in his biography. He's one of the early phone hackers. Well, he's one of the early hackers who found that frequencies would change the American dial tones. 2600 is the frequency he used to blow a whistle that he got from a cereal box, a Captain Crunch cereal box, which is how he generated the name Captain Crunch. Well, I first met him when I was 18. He was travelling around Australia and wanted to meet local cyber luminaries, and I already had a bit of skin in the game, so to speak, with regards to writing antiviral software and DJing and a bunch of other things. So anyway, I met this fellow, and he proceeded to do what he described as an energy blockage removal on me, which was fundamentally a form of physical assault, for want of a better term. It became very dark, actually. If people want to look John Draper Crunch up in Wikipedia, they can see that this has been moved out of just what was physical assault to another form of assault. Anyway, I've written about that in his biography. So the nature of books, the nature of meeting my childhood heroes, I spent a small period of time with Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple. So I've had various points in my life where I've spent time with my childhood heroes. It's always terrible. Like, it's always really bad. Meeting Jackson and Livingston was quite nice. They're both interesting people. I had the opportunity of spending a little bit of time with them at their fighting fantasy test. Fighting fantasy. I don't know it's like a convention that they run each year for fighting fantasy. But that was interesting because I, at the time, would still represent Netflix in some capacity. And Netflix was going through a period where they had released what was called Bandersnatch, which was like Choose Your Own Adventure, but for video, real-time watching. But it was very much associated with this 1980s computer games here, fundamentally not role-playing games, but they're all part of the same soup, so to speak. I think that, role-playing games became, as you say, you did it in text-based format. The only distinction between a role-playing game as I'd play it with pen and paper and an adventure game on a computer is you have the ability to do a wide variety of really curious manipulation when you play a role-playing game on pen and paper, which you don't have in software. It'd be wonderful in software to have the amount of dynamism that enabled characters to start doing a variety of different things that I've seen while I've hosted these role-playing games. But it is fundamentally the ability to create fantastic environments that you could never describe in computer video games, although increasingly these things are pushed with regards to the boundaries. You're really dealing with a different kind of cognitive force when you do role-playing to the extent, I mean, I never got into live action or any of the other things. I never, wore fake armor or anything like that. But I certainly was very much interested in mythology, mythical creatures, the mapping of mythology, which is fundamentally Tolkien, back onto actually parts of England and Wales and Scotland. I mean, the nature that a lot of this role-playing comes from deep mythology, which is based in actual things, and the way in which really, we were talking about the Second World War. The Second World War is moving into the realm of mythology now. It's moved from being a series of facts to a series of facts no one can remember, into this thing which is more about, as you say, talking in a very grand fashion about these stories that very few people actually have any first-person contact with. When COVID started, my wife and I used to travel to England primarily and also Australia. So when COVID started, we had this little bit of money left over, which was previously our travel budget. And at the time, a fellow called Plotnik, who was part of the creation of the Belgian state. He was in the before it was the Netherlands and that broke away, all this kind of thing. Anyway, he fought in a series of different battles, including Waterloo. And at the time, I found his medals available online. So my daughters can hold in their hand a medal from the Battle of Waterloo, right? But that is all mythology now. The whole thing is, there's a thing that happens with history where it moves from the point of certain writable facts, and we're talking about the origin of computers, Wozniak, John Draper Crunch. These people are in a mythology sphere more than they're in a history sphere. And that's something that I find very interesting as I live my life going back and meeting my childhood heroes, realizing that all they're doing is perpetuating their mythology, not actually talking about the kind of darker aspects of, what they did in this case of this John Draper Crunch guy, literally physically assaulting everyone he came in contact with because he wanted to determine whether or not the people could be trusted. Well, that's what he said at the time and said to me since. It's to determine whether or not you could trust people is you've got to do this extremely laborious what he calls an energy blockage removal technique, which involves basically him hanging on your back and you doing push-ups and a variety of other things. I mean, it really is very strange. When you have an experience with reality of these things, you start to realize that so much of one's life is actually pinned on these mythologies. In fact, the nature of human society is fundamentally about mythology, because that's the way you can create these immensely curious cities with these monkey-like creatures that just wander through them.
That's a really interesting point, actually, in that what we have, this idea of facts, we'll call them facts from World War II, now moving into the realm of mythology, and the lines between what is effectively the facts and the not facts, let's call them, is very much blurred, and I think that kind of issue is only going to get perpetuated more and more as time goes on, especially with all the misinformation and stuff that is happening at the moment. You mentioned fighting fantasy, and it's really interesting because it sparked a memory that I had. So I think I was a little bit late for fighting fantasy, but I remember we went to what is called a car boot sale here in the UK. I don't know what the best translation would be. Like a yard sale, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really a yard sale.
Because it happens at a place, like a group of people get together, open up their car boots, and then sell stuff. Yeah.
And we came home one day, and I got the board game of, I think it was it Warlock of Firetop Mountain?
That's the first one. Yep.
Well, yeah. So I actually had that in a board game fashion, and I remember opening it. I must have been 7 or 8 at the time. I remember opening it, and it was quite confusing. I couldn't make head and tails of it. And it turns out because there were some pieces that were missing, and I couldn't quite set the game the way I wanted to. as is the way, it's heavily damaged and heavily used. So I guess, if I have one small experience with the fighting fantasy series, that's probably it. But yeah, gosh, I probably have that at home somewhere still. But no, I think your point again about pen and paper, or in my case, it was sort of text and forum based adventures of role playing games being, much broader, much grander, much richer, forcing you to be much more creative. I think I completely agree with you. I Yeah, it does. I've seen in myself, especially at that age, because I was playing at probably a similar time to you, I guess. I was sort of, 11, 12, 13 at school, doing all of my schooling, but also in the evenings, and staying up far too late, talking with a bunch of Americans and Canadians and whoever else might be playing. Just creating these stories on this forum, and there are far less constraints on that type of format, where the world can be. I mean, of course there are rule sets and there are constraints in all the various manuals that you might be working from, but that world building can literally be whatever you want it to be in large parts. And even as playing as a game master or a dungeon master or whatever you want to call it, you're never quite sure what you might need to react to. And what the other players in the game might be doing. And I think for me at that age, it was quite formative in my creative writing and my creative thinking. And it's interesting because I've had this conversation or similar conversations with people in various communities, and I would love to see the Venn diagram of people in A Life who have also played these types of games, because I would hedge my bets and say it's quite large. I think, there are just common themes, right? People in A Life, it attracts a certain type of person, and that type of person is probably the same type of person that is going to be playing these types of games and engaging in these types of formats. I don't know what your experiences are in that regard, but at least in my experiences, I've seen, A Life has just tend to be more likely to be playing things like Dungeons and Dragons. So it was actually on Dungeons and Dragons. I think I played a bit of 3rd edition, and then I didn't play it for a long time, and then I played a bit of 5th more recently, but I've not played for a long time. But yeah, I mean, that's probably something that I would love to get back into at some point. But it just takes time. I mean, we commit to so many things, and like you said, it's if you're committing to a campaign or whatever for 18 months to 2 years, it necessarily requires that you have the same group of people week in, week out. But no, I think the point of just all of that with respect to how it overlaps to creativity, I think is just nice, and I think it's really, really important. And it was a point actually I mentioned in our show notes that we probably won't get to today, but just the importance of actually engaging in these types of things is, well, both as a child actually, but also as we get older. I think it's something that we lose that element of play, of creativity, and I do wish that I could see more adults, more people in sort of older ages engage with these types of things, because I do think it could be massively valuable.
It would be a different world if more adults got into this kind of stuff. A better world, one would hope, at least, where you didn't have to fight wars, you just could do role-playing games instead. But anyway, Imy, it's been an absolute pleasure. We've made the hour perfectly. I don't know what the next one... I did float the idea that maybe we might be able to touch on theism and science at some stage, so maybe that is that would be great. So I mean, on my end, I am preparing for A Life, so I'm flying out to Japan next week. So we can do a couple of things. We can either sort of do a debrief of the conference the week after, if you why don't we do that? Why don't we do that, because obviously these conferences are intense, for want of a better term, and the way you could decompress it on a podcast is probably going to be luxury for the listeners as well.
Yeah, let's do that. Awesome.
Imy, it's been a pleasure as always. Look forward to talking to you soon. Take care.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.